The autumn of 1862 brought Jeremiah Snawfus and his family to the Lee Creek Valley in the Arkansas Territory, where the towering sandstone formations of what locals whispered as Devil's Den cast their ancient shadows across the rugged landscape. The Civil War raged to the east, but here in the remote hollows of the Ozark Mountains, the Snawfus clan sought refuge from a world gone mad with brother fighting brother. What they found instead was a place where older, darker conflicts had never truly ended. Jeremiah was a tall, weathered man of 43 years, with hands calloused from decades of hard labor and eyes that held the determination of someone who had lost everything once and refused to lose it again. The war had claimed his farm in Tennessee, burned by Union raiders who left nothing but ash and bitter memories. His wife, Constance, 38 and still beautiful despite the hardships that had aged her prematurely, rode beside him on the wagon seat, her arms wrapped protectively around their youngest, 6-year-old Mercy. Behind them, bouncing with each rut in the barely discernible trail, sat their other children, Thomas, 16 and eager to prove himself a man, Mary, 14 and already showing the haunting beauty that would define the women of her bloodline, and little Samuel, 8 years old, and possessed of an unsettling wisdom that often made adults uncomfortable. The trail that led them to their new homestead was one that few white settlers had dared to travel. The Cherokee who had once called this land home had been forced west on the Trail of Tears 30 years earlier, but their warnings about certain places in the mountains lingered in the whispered conversations of those brave or foolish enough to venture into the deepest hollows. Devil's Den, they said, was a place where the spirits of the ancient ones still walked, where the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead grew thin as morning mist. As their wagon creaked and groaned up the rocky path toward what would become their new home, Constance felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October wind cutting through the trees. The forest around them seemed too quiet, as if every bird and creature had fled from something that lurked just beyond the edge of sight. Even the horses seemed nervous, their ears constantly twitching and their eyes rolling white whenever they passed particularly deep shadows between the towering oaks and hickories. "Papa," little Mercy whispered, pressing closer to her mother's side. "I don't like this place. It feels wrong." Jeremiah turned to look at his youngest daughter, noting the way her small hands clutched at Constance's shawl and how her usually bright blue eyes had gone wide with an fear that seemed far too mature for her 6 years. "It's just a new place, darling," he said, trying to keep his voice steady and reassuring. "Sometimes new places feel strange until we make them our own." But even as he spoke the words, Jeremiah felt the truth of his daughter's observation settling into his bones like the autumn cold. There was something fundamentally unsettling about this stretch of the Lee Creek Valley, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up and his hand instinctively move to rest on the rifle that lay across his knees. The very air seemed thick with watching presences, as if unseen eyes tracked their every movement from the depths of the surrounding forest. The homestead they were approaching had been abandoned for nearly 2 years, according to the Cherokee woman who had sold them the deed for a fraction of what the land was worth. She had been reluctant to part with the paper, even at such a low price, and had insisted on performing some kind of ritual with burning sage and strange words in her native tongue before handing over the title. When Jeremiah had asked her why the previous family had left, she had simply looked at him with eyes that held generations of sorrow and said, "Some places are not meant for the living." Now, as they crested the final hill and saw their new home spread out before them in the fading afternoon light, Jeremiah began to understand what she meant. The cabin was sturdy enough, built from local oak and fieldstone, with a stone chimney that rose like a gnarled finger toward the grey October sky. But there was something subtly wrong with the proportions, something that made the eye want to look away rather than study the structure too closely. The windows seemed positioned at odd angles, and the door was painted a deep red that had darkened over time to the color of dried blood. More disturbing than the house itself, however, were the markings that surrounded it. Carved into trees, scratched into rocks and burned into fence posts were symbols that none of the Snawfus family recognized. They looked neither Christian nor Cherokee, but rather seemed to belong to something far older and more primitive. The symbols were everywhere once you started looking for them, creating intricate patterns that seemed to pulse and shift when viewed from the corner of the eye. "What do you suppose those marks mean?" Thomas asked, pointing to a particularly elaborate carving on a massive oak tree that stood like a sentinel beside the cabin's front door. Jeremiah studied the symbol for a long moment, noting how it seemed to twist and writhe, even though he knew it was just carved wood. The marking looked almost like intertwined serpents, but there was something about the way the lines curved and intersected that suggested something far more complex and disturbing. "Probably just Cherokee hunting marks," he said finally, though even he didn't believe his own words. "Nothing for us to worry about." As they began unloading their few possessions from the wagon, the forest around them seemed to grow even quieter, as if every living thing was holding its breath in anticipation of something terrible. The sun, which had been struggling to break through the thick canopy of leaves all day, began to sink toward the horizon with what seemed like unnatural speed, casting long shadows that reached toward the cabin like grasping fingers. It was Mary who first noticed the ground around the cabin. While helping her mother carry their meager belongings inside, she paused and knelt down to examine the earth near the front steps. "Mama!" she called, her voice carrying a note of confusion that quickly transformed into unease. "Come look at this." Constance set down the bundle of quilts she was carrying and moved to where her daughter crouched. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The soil around the cabin wasn't the rich, dark earth they had expected to find in this fertile valley. Instead, it was a pale, almost white dirt that seemed to shimmer with an inner light even in the gathering dusk. More disturbing still, nothing grew in this strange soil. While the forest pressed close to the clearing on all sides, no grass, no weeds, no flowers, nothing green had managed to take root in the circle of pale earth that surrounded their new home. "It's probably just a different type of soil," Constance said, but her words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. She reached down to touch the strange earth and immediately jerked her hand back with a gasp. The soil was ice cold, so cold that it burned her fingertips like touching snow in winter. More than that, it seemed to pulse beneath her touch, as if something alive writhed just beneath the surface. As the family worked to settle into their new home, other strange details began to reveal themselves. The well, which should have provided fresh, clear water from the mountain springs that fed the valley, instead produced a liquid that tasted of minerals and something else, something that coated the tongue with a metallic bitterness that lingered long after drinking. The interior of the cabin, despite being constructed from solid oak logs, was perpetually cold, as if the very walls were incapable of holding warmth. Most disturbing of all were the sounds that began as soon as the sun disappeared behind the western ridgeline. From somewhere deep beneath the cabin came a sound like wind rushing through underground passages, but wind that carried with it voices, whispers in languages that predated any tongue spoken by European settlers or even the Cherokee who had once called this land home. The whispers seemed to seep up through the floorboards and down through the roof, surrounding the family, with a constant murmur of words they could not understand, but that filled them with a growing sense of dread. "It's just the wind in the caves," Jeremiah told his family as they huddled around the fireplace that first night, though the fire seemed unable to drive away the cold that had settled into their bones. This whole area is riddled with limestone caves. The sound carries up through cracks in the rock. But even as he spoke, Jeremiah knew that no natural wind had ever carried voices that seemed to speak directly to the fear centers of the human brain. And no cave system he had ever heard of produced the rhythmic, almost musical quality of the sounds that rose from beneath their feet. It was as if something far below was conducting a ceremony, chanting in unison with voices that had been stilled by death, but refused to accept silence. The livestock they had brought with them seemed to sense the wrongness of the place even more acutely than the humans. The horses refused to graze on the grass that grew near the pale soil, and when forced to drink from the well, they did so reluctantly and with eyes that rolled white with terror. The chickens they had brought would not roost in the coop Jeremiah built for them, instead huddling together in a terrified mass as far from the cabin as they could get, while still remaining within the fenced area. By the third day, the animals had begun to die. It started with the chickens, which Constance found stiff and cold in the morning despite having been healthy and active the night before. There were no signs of predation, no blood or disturbed feathers, no indication of disease or injury. They had simply died, as if something had reached into their small bodies and stolen the very essence of life. The horses followed soon after. Jeremiah woke on the fourth morning to find his faithful mare, Belle, lying motionless in the makeshift corral he had constructed behind the cabin. Like the chickens, she showed no signs of violence or illness. Her eyes were open and staring, but the warm brown that had once held intelligence and spirit had faded to a dull, milky white that reminded him uncomfortably of the strange soil that surrounded their home. As the days passed and more animals succumbed to whatever force was claiming them, the children began to change as well. It started subtly, with small alterations in behavior that could easily be attributed to the stress of moving to a new place during such turbulent times. Thomas, who had always been energetic and eager to help with farm work, became listless and distant, spending hours staring at nothing while muttering under his breath in words that sounded suspiciously like the whispers that rose from beneath the cabin. Mary, who had always been a cheerful, talkative girl, grew silent and withdrawn, often disappearing for hours at a time, only to be found standing perfectly still in the forest, her eyes fixed on something that only she could see. When questioned about these episodes, she would simply shake her head and say that she had been listening to the teachers in the trees. Little Samuel began drawing pictures with charcoal from the fireplace, creating images that were far too complex and disturbing for a child of 8 years to conceive. The drawings showed pale figures with elongated limbs and eyes like empty sockets, gathered around what appeared to be an altar made of white stone. In the background of every picture, he drew the cabin where they now lived, but in his renderings, it was not alone. Surrounding it were dozens of other structures, as if the solitary homestead was just one building in a vast, hidden city. And Mercy, their youngest, began speaking to invisible companions, carrying on lengthy conversations with entities she called the Pale Teachers. When pressed about who these teachers were, she would only say that they had been sleeping beneath the ground for a very long time, but that the family's arrival had awakened them and they were very hungry. As October gave way to November and the mountain cold settled into the valley with a vengeance, Jeremiah found himself spending more and more time studying the strange symbols that decorated every surface around their homestead. He had initially dismissed them as Cherokee markings, but the more he examined them, the more convinced he became that they belonged to something far older and more alien than any human culture he had ever encountered. The symbols seemed to tell a story, though one that filled him with increasing dread as he began to piece together their meaning. They spoke of beings that had existed in this place long before humans ever set foot in the Americas, entities that existed in the spaces between life and death, neither fully alive nor truly dead. The markings suggested that these beings had once walked openly in the world, but had been bound by ancient rituals and forced to slumber beneath the earth until certain conditions were met. What those conditions were, Jeremiah could not fully decipher, but one thing was becoming terrifyingly clear. Their arrival at the homestead, their decision to build their lives on this particular patch of cursed ground, had somehow fulfilled at least part of the requirements for awakening whatever slept below. As November deepened and the first snows began to dust the mountain peaks that surrounded their valley, the whispers from beneath the cabin grew louder and more insistent. Sometimes, late at night when the wind was still, Jeremiah could almost make out individual words in the stream of alien voices. They spoke of hunger, of centuries of waiting, of a debt that had come due, and a price that would be paid in blood and soul. And sometimes in the darkest hours before dawn, he heard his own name spoken in those underground chambers, pronounced with an anticipation that made his blood run cold and his hands shake with a fear he had never known in all his years of war and hardship. The Pale Teachers, as Mercy called them, were stirring, and the Snawfus family, in their desperate search for a new beginning, had become the key to awakening something that should have remained buried forever in the haunted depths of Devil's Den. The first manifestation came on a moonless night in late November, when the mountain cold had settled into the valley like a living thing, and the whispers from beneath the cabin had grown so loud that sleep was nearly impossible for the Snawfus family. Constance was the first to see them, waking from a fitful doze to find pale figures standing at the foot of her bed, their forms so translucent that she could see the rough cabin walls through their ethereal bodies. The beings were tall and impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch and bend in ways that defied human anatomy. Their skin, if it could be called skin, was the color of fresh snow, but with an inner luminescence that pulsed in rhythm with the whispered chanting that rose from the earth below. Most disturbing of all were their eyes, which were not the black holes that Samuel had drawn in his disturbing pictures, but rather pools of swirling mist that seemed to contain the accumulated wisdom and malice of centuries. "Jeremiah," Constance whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own racing heartbeat. But when she turned to wake her husband, she found that he was already awake, his eyes fixed on the pale visitors with an expression of mingled terror and horrible fascination. "Don't move," he breathed, his hands slowly reaching for the rifle that leaned against the wall beside their bed. "Don't let them know you can see them." But it was too late for such precautions. The moment Constance had spoken, the beings had turned their misty eyes toward her, and she felt their attention settle on her like a physical weight. The temperature in the room, already uncomfortably cold, plummeted further, and her breath began to mist in the air, as if she was standing outside in the depths of winter. One of the beings, taller and more substantial than the others, stepped forward. When it moved, Constance could hear the sound of wind through dry leaves, and when it opened its mouth to speak, its voice was like the whisper of snow falling on stone. "We have waited," it said, the words seeming to come from the walls themselves rather than from the creature's throat. "So long have we waited for the barriers to weaken, for the old bindings to fade. You have come to us as the ancient prophecies foretold. Your life essence will feed our return to the realm of substance." Jeremiah's hand found his rifle, but when he tried to raise it, he discovered that his body would no longer obey his commands. A paralysis had settled over him, not just of muscle, but of will itself, as if something was reaching into his mind and numbing the very impulses that drove human action. Beside him, Constance was experiencing the same terrifying helplessness, her body frozen in place, while her mind screamed warnings that her vocal cords could not voice. "The children," the pale being continued, its misty eyes turning toward the door that led to the room where Thomas, Mary, Samuel, and Mercy slept. "They will serve as vessels for our return. Young flesh adapts more readily to our presence. Young minds bend without breaking." As if summoned by the creature's words, the sound of small footsteps could be heard in the hallway outside the bedroom. But these were not the normal, eager footsteps of children rising early for breakfast or rushing outside to play. These steps were measured, deliberate, and completely silent, except for the soft whisper of bare feet on wooden floorboards. The bedroom door opened without a sound, and the Snawfus children filed into the room with their parents. But these were not the same children who had gone to bed the night before. Their eyes had changed, taking on the same misty, unfocused quality as those of the pale beings who surrounded them. Their skin had begun to lighten, as if the color was slowly draining out of their bodies like water from a broken vessel. Most horrifying of all was the way they moved, with a fluid grace that was entirely unnatural for human children. They seemed to glide rather than walk, and when they breathed, mist rose from their lips, just as it did from those of the spectral entities that had claimed them. "Papa," little Mercy said, but her voice carried harmonics that no human throat could produce, as if multiple beings were speaking through her small body simultaneously. "The pale teachers have shown us such wonderful things. They've shown us how to step between the world of flesh and the world of spirit. They've taught us songs that can call down the stars and make the earth itself remember the time before time." Jeremiah tried to speak, to call out to his daughter, to beg the entities to release his children and take him instead, but the paralysis that held him was complete, extending even to his ability to form words. He could only watch in mounting horror as his youngest child, his precious Mercy, spoke with the voice of something that had never been human and never would be. Thomas stepped forward, his 16-year-old frame seeming to stretch and elongate as he moved, as if whatever inhabited him was reshaping his body to better suit its needs. "The old Cherokee knew," he said, his voice deeper than it had ever been, resonating with an authority that belonged to something ancient and terrible. "They knew that this place was a threshold, a gateway between the realm of the living and the domain of those who exist beyond death. They placed bindings here, rituals of containment that held us in check for generations." Mary moved to stand beside her brother, her 14-year-old beauty transforming into something alien and disturbing as her features began to shift and flow like wax in heat. "But bindings weaken over time," she continued, picking up the narrative as if she and Thomas were two parts of the same consciousness. "And when the Cherokee were driven from this land, when their rituals were no longer performed, when their songs of containment were no longer sung, the barriers began to crumble. Samuel, the youngest boy, opened his mouth and began to emit a sound that was part whisper, part wind, and part the grinding of stone against stone. As he made this inhuman noise, the symbols carved into the cabin walls began to glow with the same pale luminescence that emanated from the spectral beings. The carvings seemed to writhe and shift, forming new patterns that hurt the eye to look upon directly. "Your arrival completed the process," the tall, pale being explained, its misty eyes fixed on Jeremiah with an intensity that seemed to bore into his soul. "Human habitation of this threshold space, the placement of your dwelling over our resting place, the mixing of your life essence with the soil that covers our ancient prison. All of this served to dissolve the final barriers that held us bound." As the being spoke, Constance became aware of a new and terrible development. She could feel her own life force being slowly drained away, pulled from her body by invisible threads that connected her to each of the pale entities that surrounded the bed. The sensation was not painful, but rather felt like the gradual onset of a profound and permanent exhaustion. Her vision began to blur at the edges, and she could feel her heartbeat slowing as whatever vital energy that sustained her was siphoned away to feed the growing substance of the beings that had claimed her family. But worse than the physical drain was the mental intrusion she felt as the entities began to rifle through her memories, stealing not just her life force, but her very identity. She could feel decades of experiences being pulled from her mind, examined and discarded like a child sorting through a box of toys. Her first kiss, the birth of her children, the laughter and tears and countless small moments that made up a human life, all of it was being consumed and transformed into fuel for something that had never known love or joy or any of the emotions that defined humanity. The process will take time, the pale being continued, apparently addressing both Jeremiah and Constance, though neither was capable of responding. We have been without substance for so long that we must rebuild our connection to the physical realm gradually. Your children will serve as our anchors, their young bodies providing the foundation we need to manifest fully in your world. And you, the parents, will provide the life essence necessary to complete our transformation. Throughout this horrifying explanation, the spectral beings continued to grow more solid and substantial. What had begun as translucent, almost invisible presences were now clearly visible entities with definite form and substance. Their pale skin was taking on texture and weight. Their misty eyes were solidifying into organs capable of seeing and being seen, and their ethereal voices were developing the depth and resonance of beings with physical vocal cords. As they grew more real, the Snawfus children grew correspondingly less human. Their skin continued to lighten until it matched the pale luminescence of their possessors. Their movements became increasingly fluid and unnatural, and their voices developed the same multi-tonal harmonics that characterized the speech of the ancient entities that had claimed them. The transformation was not limited to the immediate family. Throughout the homestead, other changes were taking place as well. The strange white soil that surrounded the cabin began to pulse with a rhythmic light that synchronized with the heartbeats of the pale beings. The symbols carved into the trees and fence posts started to emit a low humming sound, as if they were components in some vast, otherworldly machine that was finally powering up after centuries of dormancy. From the forest that surrounded the clearing came new sounds, the rustle of movement that was too large and too coordinated to be natural wildlife. Other beings were stirring in the depths of the woods, creatures that had slumbered alongside the pale entities and were now awakening in response to their master's return to the physical realm. The well behind the cabin began to bubble and hiss, and the water that rose from its depths was no longer the clear mountain spring water that the family had been reluctantly consuming. Instead, a thick, viscous liquid that glowed with the same pale light as the beings themselves began to overflow the stone walls, spreading across the ground in streams that followed the carved symbols and seemed to be feeding some kind of vast underground network. Inside the cabin, the whispers that had plagued the family since their arrival grew louder and more distinct. But now they were no longer coming from beneath the floorboards. Instead, they seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, as if the very structure of their home was becoming a mouth through which the pale entities could speak. "You have served your purpose well," the tall being said, its voice now carrying the full weight and authority of something that had ruled over vast domains in ages past. "Your family line will be remembered in our songs of conquest. When we have reclaimed this realm and restored the old ways, when the boundaries between life and death have been erased and all existence bows before our will, the sacrifice of the Snawfus clan will be honored as the key that unlocked our prison." As dawn approached and the first weak rays of sunlight began to filter through the cabin windows, The pale beings did not fade, as Jeremiah had desperately hoped they would. Instead, they remained as solid and present as they had been at the height of their nocturnal manifestation. The transformation was complete, or near enough to completion, that the arrival of daylight posed no threat to their newfound substance. The children, now fully transformed into vessels for the ancient entities, began to move through the cabin with purposeful intent. They gathered items that seemed random to human eyes, but that clearly held significance in whatever plan the pale beings were implementing. Stones from the fireplace, water from the well soil, from the white earth that surrounded their home, and various other materials were collected and arranged in patterns that followed the same alien geometry as the symbols carved throughout the homestead. As they worked, they sang in voices that harmonized with the whispers from the walls and the humming of the activated symbols. The song they sang was in no language that human ears had ever heard, but its meaning was unmistakable even to those who could not understand the words. It was a song of awakening, of ancient powers stirring from long slumber, of barriers falling and old dominions being reclaimed. And throughout it all, Jeremiah and Constance could only watch in paralyzed horror as their children, their precious children, became the instruments through which something unimaginably old and alien prepared to reclaim a world it had lost in the mists of prehistoric time. The pale beings were no longer content to simply exist. They were preparing to expand their influence beyond the boundaries of Devil's Den, to spread their corruption throughout the Ozark Mountains and beyond. And the Snawfus family, in their desperate search for a new home and a fresh start, had become the catalyst for an awakening that would reshape the very nature of reality in ways that the human mind could not fully comprehend. The old Cherokee warnings had been true. Some places were indeed not meant for the living, and now it was too late to heed that ancient wisdom. December brought with it a transformation so complete and terrifying that by the winter solstice, the Snawfus homestead had become something that belonged more to nightmare than to the natural world. The pale beings that had emerged from their ancient slumber beneath Devil's Den were no longer content to merely manifest through the bodies of the Snawfus children. They had begun to reshape reality itself around their domain, turning the family's cabin and the surrounding land into a beachhead for their invasion of the world of the living. Jeremiah and Constance, still trapped in the paralysis that the entities had imposed upon them, were forced to witness every moment of their children's continuing transformation. What had begun as simple possession had evolved into something far more complex and horrifying. The pale beings were not merely using the children's bodies as temporary vessels, they were rewriting the fundamental nature of those bodies, transforming human flesh into something that could serve as a permanent bridge between the realm of the dead and the world of the living. Thomas, once a strong and healthy 16-year-old boy, had become something that defied easy description. His body had stretched and elongated until he stood nearly 7 feet tall, but this height came not from natural growth, but from an unnatural lengthening of his bones and joints. His skin had taken on the same luminescent quality as the pale beings, and when he moved, it was with a fluid grace that suggested his skeleton had been completely restructured according to alien principles. Most disturbing of all were his eyes, which had been completely replaced by the same swirling mists that characterized the vision of the pale entities. When he looked at his parents, Jeremiah could see in those misty depths not just the consciousness of the being that had claimed his son, but layer upon layer of other intelligences, as if Thomas had become a conduit through which multiple entities could observe and interact with the physical world. "Father," Thomas said one morning as he stood at the foot of his parents' bed, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through dimensions that human ears should not have been able to perceive. "Do you understand now what we have become? Do you comprehend the gift that has been given to your bloodline?" Jeremiah could not respond. could not even move his eyes to look away from the thing that had once been his eldest son. But the being that spoke through Thomas seemed to read his thoughts as easily as if they were spoken aloud. "You fear for us," Thomas continued, a smile that was not quite human spreading across his transformed features. "You mourn for the children you believe we have consumed, but you do not understand. We have not destroyed your offspring. We have elevated them. We have given them access to knowledge that spans millennia, to powers that can reshape reality itself. They are no longer bound by the limitations of human flesh or human mortality." As if to demonstrate this claim, Thomas raised one elongated hand and gestured toward the cabin wall. The wood responded to his motion, flowing and reshaping itself like liquid, forming intricate patterns that hurt to look at directly. Where his fingers pointed, new symbols appeared, carved deep into the oak, as if the timber itself was eager to bear these alien markings. Mary had undergone a transformation that was, if anything, even more dramatic than her brother's. The 14-year-old girl, who had once helped her mother with household chores, had become something that seemed to exist partially in the physical world and partially in some other dimension entirely. Her form flickered and shifted constantly, sometimes appearing as solid as any human being, sometimes becoming so translucent that the furniture behind her was clearly visible through her body. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if sound itself bent around her transformed presence. "The old Cherokee understood," she said, her words echoing from the walls and ceiling as much as from her throat. "They knew that this place was a nexus, a point where the boundaries between worlds grew thin. They used this knowledge wisely, performing rituals that kept the balance, that prevented either realm from overwhelming the other." As Mary continued to speak, the temperature in the cabin dropped even further, and frost began to form on the windows, despite the fire that burned continuously in the hearth. But this was not ordinary frost. Instead of forming random patterns, the ice crystals arranged themselves into the same symbols that had been appearing throughout the homestead, creating elaborate mandalas of meaning that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "But the Cherokee were driven away," Mary continued, her form becoming more substantial as her voice grew stronger. "Their rituals were abandoned, their songs of binding were forgotten. The balance was lost, and we began to stir in our long slumber. We began to remember our hunger, our desire to walk once more in the realm of substance and sensation." Samuel, the 8-year-old who had shown such disturbing artistic talent, had become something that seemed to exist primarily as a conduit for communication between the pale beings and their underground domain. His small body had been hollowed out and reshaped into a living antenna, capable of receiving and transmitting signals across vast distances and through multiple dimensions. When he spoke, it was not with one voice, but with dozens, as if every pale entity that dwelt beneath Devil's Den was using his throat to add its own words to the conversation. "The process has begun," they said through him, the words overlapping and interweaving in patterns that conveyed meaning on levels deeper than simple language. "The awakening spreads. Others like us stir in their ancient resting places throughout these mountains. The network of power that once spanned this continent begins to reactivate." As the days passed, it became clear that the transformation of the Snawfus children was just the beginning of a much larger process. Through their possessed offspring, the pale beings began to tell Jeremiah and Constance the true history of the land they had chosen for their new home. A history that stretched back thousands of years before the first human beings had ever set foot in the Americas. "This realm was once ours," the being that spoke through Little Mercy explained, her 6-year-old body serving as the vessel for something that claimed to have existed since the birth of consciousness itself. "We walked openly in the world when the earth was young, when the boundaries between life and death were fluid and permeable. We ruled over vast cities that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, commanding legions of creatures that your limited human imagination could never conceive. The story they told was one of cosmic conflict, of a war between forces that represented fundamentally different approaches to existence. On one side were the pale beings and their allies, creatures that sought to merge the realms of life and death, to create a universe where consciousness could exist without the limitations of physical form. On the other side were entities that championed separation, that insisted on clear boundaries between the living and the dead, between the material and the spiritual. The war lasted for eons, Thomas continued, his elongated form pacing the cabin with movements that seemed to follow mathematical principles rather than biological ones. Entire star systems were consumed in the conflict. Realities were born and destroyed in the space between heartbeats. In the end, we were defeated not by superior force, but by superior cunning. Our enemies did not destroy us, for we were too fundamental to existence to be simply eliminated. Instead, they bound us, imprisoned us in deep places beneath the earth, and set guardians to ensure we could never again walk freely in the realms of substance. The Cherokee, according to this ancient history, had been among those guardians. Their ancestors had been given knowledge of the pale being's nature and the rituals necessary to maintain their imprisonment. For countless generations, Cherokee shamans had performed the ceremonies that kept the ancient bindings strong, that prevented the sleeping entities from breaking free of their underground prisons. But guardianship requires continuity, Mary explained, her flickering form becoming momentarily solid as she leaned close to her paralyzed parents. It requires the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next, the maintenance of traditions that must never be allowed to lapse. When the Cherokee were driven from this land, when their culture was shattered and their people scattered, the chain of guardianship was broken. The pale beings had not awakened immediately when the Cherokee guardians were removed. Instead, they had stirred slowly over the course of decades, their consciousness gradually returning as the binding rituals grew weaker through neglect. By the time the Snawfus family arrived at Devil's Den, the entities had been on the verge of breaking free entirely. The family's decision to build their home directly over the ancient prison had provided the final catalyst needed to complete their awakening. "You were not chosen randomly," Samuel explained, his childish voice carrying the weight of multiple consciousnesses. "The Pale Teachers guided you here, influenced your decisions in ways so subtle that you believed them to be your own. Every choice that led you to this place, every circumstance that drove you from your old life, was orchestrated to bring you to this moment." As the winter deepened and the solstice approached, the transformation of the homestead accelerated dramatically. The pale soil that had initially surrounded only the cabin began to spread outward, creeping through the forest like a slow-moving disease that drained the color from everything it touched. Trees that had stood for centuries withered and died as the alien earth reached their roots, their green needles and leaves fading to the same luminescent white that characterized the pale beings themselves. The symbols that had been carved into various surfaces throughout the property began to multiply and spread, appearing spontaneously on rocks, tree trunks, and even the very air itself, where they hung like three-dimensional constructs made of crystallized light. Each new symbol that appeared seemed to strengthen the network of power that the pale beings were building, creating a vast geometric pattern that extended far beyond the boundaries of the Snawfus homestead. Animals that wandered into this expanding zone of influence underwent their own terrible transformations. Deer that entered the pale soil did not simply die as the Snawfus livestock had. Instead, they were absorbed into the growing network, their life essence consumed, but their forms preserved as hollow vessels that could be inhabited by the lesser entities that served the pale beings. These transformed creatures moved through the forest like ghostly sentinels, their empty eye sockets glowing with the same misty light that characterized their masters. Birds that flew too low over the contaminated area simply vanished, not crashing to earth, but rather dissolving into mist that was absorbed by the symbols floating in the air above the homestead. Fish in the streams that flowed near the pale soil began to emit their own luminescence, their scales becoming translucent as something alien took up residence in their transformed bodies. But perhaps most disturbing of all was what happened to any human beings who ventured too close to Devil's Den during this period of expansion. A Cherokee woman named Running Deer, one of the few members of her tribe who had managed to avoid forced relocation and had been living quietly in the deeper mountains, came to investigate the strange lights and sounds that had been emanating from the valley. Jeremiah and Constance, still paralyzed but fully aware, watched through the cabin windows as Running Deer approached their homestead, her weathered face grave with concern and recognition. She carried with her a bundle of sage and other sacred herbs, and she was chanting in the Cherokee language as she walked, clearly attempting to perform some kind of protective ritual. But her knowledge, while greater than that of any white settler, was incomplete. The rituals she knew were designed to reinforce existing bindings, not to re-imprison entities that had already broken free. When she stepped onto the pale soil that surrounded the cabin, the effect was immediate and horrifying. The life force began to drain from her body, just as it had from the Snawfus parents. But Running Deer's connection to the spiritual traditions of her people allowed her to resist the pull for several minutes. During those precious moments, she managed to speak words that the pale beings clearly found disturbing, Cherokee phrases that seemed to cause them actual pain and force them to momentarily reduce their manifestation. "The old bindings can be restored," she gasped, her voice carrying clearly through the thin cabin walls. "The ancient songs still have power. The guardianship can be renewed if one knows the proper ceremonies." But her resistance could not last indefinitely. The pale beings, working through their possessed human vessels, focused their combined will on the Cherokee woman, and her protective rituals began to falter. Within minutes, she too had been drained of life force and transformed into another servant of the ancient entities. Yet her brief moment of resistance had provided Jeremiah and Constance with something they had not had before: hope. If the bindings could be restored, if there were still Cherokee who possessed the knowledge necessary to re-imprison the pale beings, then perhaps their family's fate was not sealed. Perhaps there was still a way to save their children and prevent the ancient entities from spreading their influence beyond Devil's Den. But first, they would need to break free of the paralysis that held them, and that would require a miracle that seemed less likely with each passing day, as the pale beings grew stronger and their control over the transformed homestead became more complete. The winter solstice brought with it a blizzard that should have been impossible in the Arkansas mountains, a supernatural storm that painted the world in the same pale luminescence that characterized the entities now ruling over Devil's Den. But hidden within the howling wind and driving snow came an unexpected salvation. Joseph Ridge, the last traditional medicine man of the Cherokee, who still remembered the old songs and the ancient ways of binding that which should not walk in the world of the living. Joseph was a man of 73 years, his face weathered like old leather and his eyes holding the accumulated wisdom of generations of his people. He had felt the awakening of the pale beings from his hidden sanctuary deep in the Boston Mountains, had sensed the disruption in the spiritual balance that his ancestors had maintained for countless centuries. Unlike Running Deer, who had attempted to face the entities with incomplete knowledge, Joseph carried within him the full tradition of the guardian songs, the ritual knowledge that had been passed down in secret through his family line, even after the forced relocation of his people. He approached the Snawfus homestead not as running deer had walking openly across the contaminated ground, but rather by following underground passages that the Cherokee had carved centuries earlier, tunnels that connected to the very caves where the pale beings had been imprisoned. These ancient pathways were protected by wards that predated the entity's current manifestation, spiritual barriers that even the pale being's growing power could not easily breach. Jeremiah and Constance first became aware of his presence when they heard singing from beneath the cabin, Cherokee words that seemed to resonate through the earth itself and create vibrations that caused the pale being's visible distress. The possessed children, who had been moving through the cabin with their usual fluid grace, suddenly became agitated, their forms flickering between human and something far more alien as competing forces battled for control of their transformed bodies. "The old singer comes," Thomas said, his elongated form writhing with what appeared to be pain as the Cherokee songs continued to rise from below. The guardian bloodline was not as completely severed as we believed. One still remembers the binding words. The pale beings began to gather their strength, calling upon their servants throughout the expanding zone of influence to converge on the homestead. The transformed animals that had been patrolling the forest began to move inward, and the symbols floating in the air above the cabin pulsed with increasing intensity as the entities prepared to defend their newly reclaimed territory. But Joseph Ridge was not approaching their stronghold unprepared. As he moved through the underground passages, he was performing rituals that his grandfather had taught him, ceremonies that had been old when the Cherokee first encountered European explorers. He carried with him sacred objects that had been hidden from government agents and missionary zealots for over a century. Stone totems carved with symbols that predated the pale being's imprisonment. Bundles of herbs that had been blessed by medicine men who walked with spirits, and most importantly, a drum made from the skin of a white buffalo that had been born during a solar eclipse. When he finally emerged from the underground passages, rising up through a concealed entrance in the root cellar behind the cabin, the effect on the pale beings was immediate and dramatic. The drum, when struck with its bone mallet, produced sounds that seemed to resonate not just through the air, but through multiple dimensions simultaneously. Each beat created ripples in reality itself, disrupting the network of power that the entities had constructed and causing their carefully maintained manifestations to waver and destabilize. "Ancient ones," Joseph called out in Cherokee, his voice carrying clearly through the supernatural storm that raged around the homestead. "You who sleep beneath the earth, you who hunger for the substance of the living, hear the words of the guardian people. Your time of walking in the flesh is ended. Return to your deep places and trouble the world no more." The response from the pale beings was immediate and violent. Every transformed creature under their influence converged on the Cherokee medicine man, moving with coordinated purpose to eliminate this threat to their newfound freedom. But Joseph had expected this reaction, and he was prepared for it. As the first wave of possessed animals reached him, he began to sing one of the guardian songs, a melody that had been composed specifically to counter the influence of the pale beings. The song was in the oldest form of Cherokee, a ceremonial language that was so ancient that even most tribal elders could no longer understand it. But its meaning was conveyed not through words, but through pure spiritual force, a musical expression of the fundamental principles that kept the realms of life and death properly separated. The effect of the song on the approaching creatures was immediate. The alien light that had inhabited their bodies began to flicker and fade, and their movements became increasingly erratic as the entities controlling them lost their grip on the physical realm. One by one, the transformed animals collapsed to the pale earth, their bodies finally allowed to experience the death that had been denied them when the pale beings first claimed them. But the Guardian song was just the beginning of Joseph's assault on the entity's power. As he continued to sing and drum, he began to move in a complex pattern around the cabin, his steps following a choreography that had been designed thousands of years earlier to contain and redirect spiritual energy. With each step, he placed sacred objects at specific points around the homestead, creating a network of protective barriers that began to constrain the pale being's ability to manifest in the physical world. Inside the cabin, the possessed Snawfus children began to convulse as competing forces battled for control of their transformed bodies. The paralysis that had held Jeremiah and Constance for weeks began to weaken as the pale beings were forced to divert more and more of their energy to defending against Joseph's ritual assault. "Father," Mercy gasped, her 6-year-old voice returning to something approaching human speech for the first time in months. "Help us. They're trying to pull us deeper, trying to take us somewhere we can't come back from." For the first time since the initial manifestation, Jeremiah found that he could move. The sensation was like blood returning to a limb that had been held motionless too long, painful but blessed relief. He struggled to sit up in bed, his muscles weak from months of enforced paralysis, and reached out toward his youngest daughter. But when his hand touched Mercy's transformed skin, he could feel the battle that was raging within her small body. The pale entity that had claimed her was fighting desperately to maintain its hold, while something deeper, some core of his daughter's original humanity, was struggling to resurface. The conflict was tearing her apart from the inside, and Jeremiah realized that if the medicine man's intervention failed, the children might not survive the process of separation from their possessors. Outside, Joseph continued his ritual, but the pale beings were not accepting defeat easily. The storm that raged around the homestead intensified beyond anything that natural weather could produce, with winds that howled like the voices of the damned and lightning that struck upward from the earth toward the sky. The symbols that floated in the air above the cabin began to pulse faster and brighter, creating a strobing effect that was designed to disrupt human consciousness and prevent effective resistance. More disturbing still, the pale beings began to call upon resources that they had not previously revealed. From the deepest caves beneath Devil's Den, other entities began to emerge, creatures that made the pale beings seem almost benevolent by comparison. These were things that had been imprisoned even before the pale beings themselves, entities so alien and malevolent that the pale beings had served as their wardens as much as their fellow prisoners. Joseph sensed the approach of these deeper horrors and knew that his current ritual would not be sufficient to contain them. He would need to perform the final binding, a ceremony that had been used only once before in Cherokee history, during the Great War between the spirit realms that had nearly destroyed the world in the time before memory. The final binding required a sacrifice, not of life but of connection to the physical world. The medicine man who performed it would succeed in re-imprisoning the entities, but at the cost of joining them in their underground exile, serving as an eternal guardian to ensure that they could never again break free. As the deeper entities began to breach the surface, emerging from fissures that opened in the pale earth around the cabin, Joseph made his decision. He began to sing the final binding, his voice taking on harmonics that seemed to resonate through the very foundations of reality. The sacred drum in his hands began to glow with its own inner light, and the buffalo skin stretched across its frame showed images of the ancient war between the realms, scenes of conflict that had shaped the spiritual landscape of the continent. The effect of the final binding was immediate and dramatic. The pale beings, who had been growing stronger and more substantial throughout their months of freedom, began to lose cohesion and fade back toward their spectral forms. The symbols that had spread throughout the forest began to dim and flicker, and the zone of pale earth that surrounded the homestead started to contract back toward its original boundaries. Inside the cabin, the possessed children began to undergo a violent transformation as the entities that had claimed them were forcibly separated from their human hosts. The process was agonizing for all involved, as months of spiritual integration had to be undone in a matter of minutes. The children's bodies, which had been reshaped according to alien principles, began to revert to their original human forms, but the sudden change threatened to tear them apart from the inside. Constance, who had also regained the ability to move as the pale being's power waned, rushed to help her children through the painful process of separation. She held them as they convulsed and screamed, their bodies fighting to remember what it meant to be human after months of existence as vessels for inhuman consciousness. Thomas was the first to complete the transformation, his elongated frame collapsing back to its original proportions with sounds like breaking bones. His eyes, which had been replaced by swirling mists, suddenly cleared to reveal the familiar brown that Jeremiah remembered from his son's childhood. But the boy who looked back at his parents was changed in ways that went deeper than physical transformation. He had been privy to the thoughts and memories of an entity that had existed for millennia, and that knowledge could never be completely erased. "I remember everything," he whispered, his voice hoarse from screaming. "I remember their plans, their history, the places where others like them still sleep. They showed me things, Papa, things that are coming, things that these mountains will see in the years ahead." Mary and Samuel underwent similar transformations, their bodies reverting to human form, while their minds struggled to process and contain the alien knowledge that had been forced upon them. Little Mercy, being the youngest and most malleable, seemed to suffer the least physical trauma from the separation. But her eyes held a depth of understanding that was disturbing to see in a 6-year-old child. Outside, Joseph's final binding was reaching its climax. The Cherokee medicine man was no longer fully present in the physical world, his form becoming translucent as he prepared to follow the pale beings into their underground prison. But before he departed, he managed to communicate one final message to the Snawfus family. "The binding will hold," he called out, his voice seeming to come from a great distance despite his physical proximity to the cabin. "But it is not permanent. Others will come in time, who possess the knowledge to break what I have repaired. You and your children must serve as the new guardians. You must learn the old songs, master the ancient rituals. The burden passes to you now." And with those words, Joseph Ridge vanished, not dying but rather stepping sideways out of the world of the living to take up eternal residence in the deep places beneath Devil's Den. The pale beings, their deeper masters, and all the transformed creatures that had served them were drawn inexorably downward, pulled back into the earth by the power of the final binding. The supernatural storm began to dissipate, and for the first time in months, natural sunlight broke through the clouds to illuminate the homestead. The pale soil that had spread throughout the forest began to darken back to its normal brown, and the symbols that had covered every surface faded until they were barely visible scratches on wood and stone. But the Snawfus family knew that their ordeal was far from over. They had been marked by their contact with the pale beings, changed in ways that could never be reversed, and they now carried the terrible responsibility of serving as guardians over something that would never stop trying to break free from its underground prison. The real horror was not what they had endured, but what they would have to endure in the years to come, as the knowledge forced upon them by the pale beings slowly drove them to understand the true nature of the spiritual landscape they now inhabited. For the Arkansas Ozarks were home to far more than just the entities they had encountered at Devil's Den. and the awakening of the pale beings had sent ripples throughout a network of ancient evils that stretched across the entire continent. Spring came late to Devil's Den in 1863, and when it finally arrived, it brought with it a deceptive sense of normalcy that did nothing to ease the burden that now rested upon the Snawfus family. The trees budded and bloomed as they had for countless seasons before, the streams ran clear with mountain snowmelt, and the birds returned to build their nests in the branches that overhung the cabin. But beneath this facade of natural order, something fundamental had changed in the spiritual landscape of the Ozark Mountains. And the Snawfus family found themselves forever changed by their encounter with forces that should never have been disturbed. Jeremiah and Constance aged visibly in the months following Joseph Ridge's sacrifice, their hair turning white and their faces etched with lines of worry that spoke of knowledge too terrible to forget. But it was the children who bore the heaviest burden. Thomas, Mary, Samuel, and Mercy had been vessels for entities that existed beyond the normal boundaries of life and death, and the experience had left them with abilities and knowledge that no human beings should possess. Thomas, now 17, found that he could see the spiritual imprints left by the pale beings throughout the Arkansas mountains. When he closed his eyes and concentrated, he could perceive a vast network of sleeping entities, all connected by underground passages and bound by rituals that were slowly weakening with the passage of time. He drew maps of this hidden realm, creating detailed charts that showed the location of every imprisoned entity from the Mississippi River to the eastern slopes of the Ozarks. "They're all connected," he explained to his parents during one of the family's nightly discussions about their changed circumstances. "Every cave system, every deep hollow, every place where the Cherokee performed their binding ceremonies. It's like a great web of spiritual energy, and Devil's Den is just one node in the network." Mary had developed the ability to hear the voices of the Cherokee ancestors, the spirits of the guardians who had maintained the bindings for countless generations. Through her, they learned the history of the pale beings and their relationship to other entities that dwelt in the dark places beneath the earth. The Cherokee spirits were patient teachers, but their message was consistently grave. The final binding performed by Joseph Ridge would not hold forever, and the Snawfus family must prepare for the day when it would fail. The pale teachers were not the greatest of the evils that sleep beneath these mountains, Mary would say, her 15-year-old voice carrying the authority of ancient wisdom. There are things deeper and older, entities that even the pale ones feared. When the network finally breaks down completely, when all the bindings fail at once, those deepest horrors will rise first. Samuel, now 9 years old, had retained the ability to communicate directly with the spiritual realm, but the knowledge he channeled was fragmentary and often cryptic. He spoke of events that would occur decades in the future, of other families who would encounter the awakening entities, of investigators who would come to study the supernatural phenomena that plagued the Arkansas mountains. "There will be 2 who call themselves demonologists," he said one evening as the family sat around their fireplace, his young voice distant and prophetic. "A man and a woman, husband and wife, who will make it their mission to study the dark things that walk in the spaces between worlds. They will come to understand that what happened here at Devil's Den was not an isolated incident, but part of a much larger pattern." Little Mercy, still only 7 years old, had perhaps been affected most profoundly by her experience as a vessel for the pale beings. She could see and communicate with spirits as easily as she could interact with living people, and she served as the family's primary link to Joseph Ridge, who continued to exist in the underground realm where he maintained the bindings that kept the pale beings imprisoned. "Uncle Joseph says that the old Cherokee knowledge isn't enough anymore," she reported after one of her spiritual conversations with the medicine man. "The world is changing too fast, and the traditional ways of dealing with these entities won't work for much longer. He says We need to learn new methods, combine the old wisdom with new understanding. As 1863 turned into 1864, the Snawfus family began to attract the attention of other people who had encountered supernatural phenomena in the Ozark region. Word spread quietly through the mountain communities that there was a family at Devil's Den who understood the old ways, who could provide guidance for those dealing with hauntings, curses, and other manifestations of spiritual disturbance. The first visitors were other families who had settled too close to Cherokee sacred sites and were experiencing problems similar to what the Snawfuses had endured. A German immigrant named Klaus Müller came from the Buffalo National River region, reporting that his family was being tormented by entities that emerged from a cave system near their homestead. The description of the beings matched what the pale entities had looked like before they achieved full manifestation. "They come at night," Muller explained in his heavily accented English, his hands shaking as he spoke. "Tall things, white like snow, with eyes that look through you. They stand at the foot of our beds and whisper in languages we cannot understand. My wife, she grows thin and weak, as if they are stealing her life away drop by drop." Thomas was able to provide guidance to the Muller family, teaching them protective rituals that combined Cherokee spiritual techniques with Christian prayers and symbols. The combination proved effective in driving back the entities, but it also confirmed the Snawfuses' growing understanding that the problem was not limited to Devil's Den. A traveling preacher named Reverend Ezekiel Porter arrived in the spring of 1864, seeking help with what he described as demonic manifestations that had begun appearing wherever he held revival meetings. The spirits that followed Porter were not the pale beings, but they were clearly related to them, entities that fed on strong emotions and religious fervor. "Every time I preach about the fires of hell and the torments of the damned," Porter explained, "something answers. Shadows move in the corners of the tent, and people begin speaking in tongues that no human language has ever known. Some of them fall into trances that last for days, and when they wake up, they speak of terrible visions, of wars between angels and demons that will consume the world." Mary was able to help Porter understand that his preaching style was inadvertently opening doorways between the spiritual and physical realms, creating opportunities for imprisoned entities to influence the living world. She taught him modified versions of the Guardian songs, disguised as Christian hymns that would close these openings and protect his congregations from unwanted spiritual intrusions. As their reputation grew, the Snawfus family began to maintain detailed records of every supernatural encounter they investigated. These documents, written primarily by Constance, who had the best handwriting and the most systematic mind, would eventually become one of the most complete archives of Ozark supernatural phenomena in existence. The records showed that the awakening of the pale beings at Devil's Den had indeed sent ripples throughout the entire network of imprisoned entities. Sites throughout Arkansas, Missouri, and eastern Oklahoma were experiencing increased supernatural activity as the spiritual barriers that had contained them for centuries continued to weaken. But the family's work was not limited to helping others deal with supernatural problems. They also served as guardians themselves, maintaining the bindings at Devil's Den and watching for signs that the pale beings might be attempting to break free once again. Every month, on the night of the new moon, the four children would perform a ritual that Joseph Ridge had taught them through their spiritual communications. They would descend into the underground passages beneath their cabin, carrying bundles of sacred herbs and reciting the modified guardian songs that Mary had learned from the Cherokee spirits. The ritual was dangerous, requiring them to maintain direct contact with the imprisoned pale beings while reinforcing the spiritual barriers that held them. During these monthly ceremonies, the children could feel the entities pressing against their confinement, testing for weaknesses in the bindings and searching for opportunities to escape. "They remember us," Thomas reported after one particularly difficult ritual. "They know who we are and what we did to them. They're not just trying to break free anymore. They're planning revenge, specifically against our family." This personal threat from the pale beings added another layer of urgency to the family's work. They were not just maintaining the bindings out of altruistic concern for the broader community. They were protecting themselves and their descendants from entities that would stop at nothing to reclaim their freedom and punish those who had confined them. As the civil war raged in the world beyond the Ozark Mountains, the Snawfus family found themselves fighting a different kind of war, one that had been going on for thousands of years and would continue long after the conflict between North and South had ended. They were soldiers in an ancient struggle between the forces of order and chaos, between those who sought to maintain the boundaries that kept the world stable and those who would tear down all barriers in pursuit of their own dark purposes. Samuel's prophetic abilities allowed them to prepare for some of the challenges they would face. He foresaw the arrival of other families who would need their help, the discovery of new sites where entities were breaking free, and the eventual expansion of their work beyond the Arkansas mountains. "There will come a time," he said during one of his prophetic episodes, "when people will study these things with scientific methods. They will try to measure and categorize the supernatural, to create theories and systems that explain what cannot be explained. Some of them will be helpful, adding their knowledge to ours, but others will be dangerous, opening doors that should remain closed." Mercy, through her communications with Joseph Ridge, learned that the Cherokee medicine man was not the only guardian maintaining bindings in the underground realm. There were others, representatives of different tribes and traditions, all working together to prevent a catastrophic breakdown of the entire network of containment. "Uncle Joseph has friends down there," she explained. "A Choctaw medicine woman who bound the water spirits in the Ouachita Mountains, and a Creek war chief who holds the fire demons beneath the Arkansas River Valley. They all work together now, sharing knowledge and strength to keep the old evils contained. But these spiritual guardians were not immortal, and their ability to maintain the bindings weakened over time. Eventually, they would need to be replaced by new guardians from the world of the living. The Snawfus children were being trained for this role, though they would not be called upon to make the ultimate sacrifice for many years to come. As 1864 drew to a close and the war between the states moved toward its conclusion, the Snawfus family began to understand the true scope of their destiny. They were not just isolated victims of a supernatural attack, nor were they simply guardians of a single site. They were part of a much larger network of individuals and families who shared the responsibility for maintaining the barriers between worlds. Through their connections with other supernatural investigators and the knowledge they gained from their spirit allies, they learned of similar incidents occurring throughout North America. European settlement had disturbed many of the sacred sites where Native American tribes had maintained spiritual bindings, and entities that had been imprisoned for millennia were beginning to stir. The Snawfus family's experience at Devil's Den was just one example of a phenomenon that would continue to spread as the frontier expanded westward and more settlers built their homes on land that had been carefully avoided by the indigenous peoples who understood its true nature. Samuel's visions showed them that their work would continue for generations, passed down from parent to child as the Cherokee had once passed down their guardian songs. The knowledge and responsibilities they had inherited would shape the destiny of their descendants, creating a bloodline of supernatural investigators and guardians who would stand between the world of the living and the horrors that dwelt in the spaces beyond death. Our children and our children's children will carry this burden, Constance wrote in the family record. They will be called to places where the veil between worlds grows thin, where entities that should remain bound seek to break free. They will serve as guardians and teachers, helping others understand and deal with supernatural threats. The legacy of the Snawfus family's encounter with the pale beings would eventually reach far beyond the Arkansas Ozarks. Their records and methods would influence other investigators of supernatural phenomena, creating a body of knowledge that would be studied and expanded upon by future generations of researchers. Most significantly, their work would help establish the foundations for what would eventually become a systematic approach to dealing with supernatural threats. An approach that would be further developed by the investigators Samuel had foreseen, the husband and wife team who would dedicate their lives to studying and combating demonic forces. As 1865 began and the nation slowly began to heal from the wounds of civil war, the Snawfus family looked toward a future that would be shaped by their encounter with forces beyond human understanding. They had survived their ordeal and emerged as guardians of knowledge that would prove essential in the battles yet to come. The pale beings remained imprisoned beneath Devil's Den, held in check by Joseph Ridge's sacrifice and the monthly rituals performed by the Snawfus children. But they had not been destroyed, merely contained, and they would continue to exert their influence on the world above, creating ripples of supernatural disturbance that would draw the attention of investigators for decades to come. The story of the Snawfus family was just the beginning of a much larger tale, one that would eventually encompass the entire continent and touch the lives of countless individuals who would find themselves confronted by the reality of the supernatural. Their legacy would endure long after the last member of their bloodline had passed from the world of the living, influencing the methods and understanding of all who would follow in their footsteps. In years to come, when demonologists and paranormal investigators studied the most significant supernatural incidents in American history, they would always return to the events at Devil's Den in the winter of 1862, recognizing them as the moment when the modern era of supernatural investigation truly began. The Snawfus family had blazed a trail that others would follow, establishing precedents and methods that would prove essential in humanity's ongoing struggle against the forces of darkness.